Rather than jumping into where we are today, I actually was thinking about where we started back in the 2000s. Data didn't seem like an issue back then, but data was there. So
20 years ago, the volume of data was not tremendous, right? GenBank was still being distributed on CDs.
Right.
What was the challenge was the kind of computation that people wanted to do, which was sort of these all versus all kinds of comparisons. And, BLAST was the big consumer.
Right.
That people were being forced off of their desktop workstations, right? They were outgrowing their desktop workstations. Data was not really a big thing. We were still looking at results more than data. So when I got involved in this pre-Blackstone, working at GTC, there was a data product, this pathogen database, and so there was definitely that market, and that's what Solera tried to do, and others getting into the data product space. But the idea of generalized data reuse was just not there, really.
Right.
So we had reference data, and we had primary data, but we weren't actually making secondary use of primary data.
Right. Then a lot of work we did was related to people getting frustrated going to NCBI because they had data, they had the short read archive and all the other stuff that people submitted to and were trying to make a centralized resource, but that really didn't quite work out the way they wanted it to.
Genomic data was the one thing that actually offered I think was definitely the leading edge of data reuse, because genomic data, even if it wasn't collected for the purpose that you were interested in, could provide a reference that would increase the statistical power of your analysis. And in many ways, genomic data was kind of at least short read genomic data was the beginning of data science and data engineering in our space.
Tell me about that. Why do you think that?
Because we weren't. This is when we started to see the modelers come in, the Bayesian modelers, the tools that were developed for analyzing short read data, GATK, right? GATK is a statistical tool package, very different from what we were using to analyze capillary data. So you have the biostats that are doing conventional statistics, but GATK and most of the modeling stuff that was being done continues to be done to kind of analyze genomic data, whether it's GWAS or the primary upstream analysis associated with alignment is probabilistic modeling. Right. So when we started seeing a lot of short read sequence, we suddenly needed not just software engineers in the lab, to make the data coming off the instrument usable, but we actually needed data engineers, data scientists in the lab. And we hadn't needed that before. So that was I would argue that gap was just not very big for most organizations. Broad was out in front of it and kind of hit it in 2007. But it was several years after that before other organizations started to feel that same organizational gap. And for me, that was the gap between IT that knew how to store and manage data and associated compute, and research that knew about the data. So that was a fine separation for a long time. Right? IT didn't need to understand the contents of the data in order to solve that, at least not the IT organizations of yesterday. And that's when data, for me, that's when data started becoming a thing. So, yeah, I'm saying that we just didn't data in this way until we started having volumes of short read data.
When we having a reference genome and then being able to compare it to a reference genome was actually a pretty good thing for the case for reuse, right?
Yes, I don't disagree. Except I distinguish between. I haven't really thought this through before, but I think I'm distinguishing between reference reuse and novel reuse.
Okay.
So GenBank, right? All of GenBank was intended to be reused, and this is pre SRA, but all of the sequencing data was going into GenBank for the organisms.
Right.
But it's used almost entirely as a reference, right? So you would take a novel sequence and blast it against GenBank. It was looking it up in a library. It wasn't actually at that point doing really novel analysis that leveraged multiple data sets.
Right.
And I'll need to think about that before I'm sure I'm going to stand beside that. But the focus was, in my experience, all about what is the data that I just generated tell me, and I need the reference data to help that tell me, but it was all about that primary use of the data that I just generated. So I was using the reference data to help interpret my primary use.
Right.
And it took a while before people started, I think, coming in and looking at all this reference data for something novel, right? So not using it as a reference against a new data set that was just generated, but looking for new knowledge, new information in the corpus of data.
Right.
So it had been used to do some tool development, right? So building gene predictors and that sort of thing. But
right.
So
then we move into a period of time where we're now starting to see the first, short read sequencers coming online, and we, Celera then becomes Illumina, and so now life changes for everybody. And is that really a defining moment in data?
okay, by metadata, argue yes. That on the life sciences side, on the research side, that was the so yeah, two things, right? So one is it removed a bottleneck in data generation. We had been one of the rate limiting factors in genomic analysis certainly was data generation. People would spend their whole PhD careers isolating a single gene, right? Mm-hmm. And suddenly we had this ability to generate data at tremendous velocity. But the second thing is that the data themselves weren't usable, right? The data that were being spewed out of these machines weren't usable by the average researcher, bioinformaticist. And so that's where I was saying about the real introduction of data engineering and data science into this space was how to distill that data coming off the sequencers into something that could be useful in a biological context.
Right. Now we're getting into places where they're getting big genome centers and big activity, and it seemed to consolidate for a little while in big genomic centers, and then it just started proliferating everywhere.
Right. So for certainly the NIH-funded sequencing ended up coming down to really, for a while, just 3 sequencing centers. And, the reasons being it was pretty capital intensive. So in order for a site to be competitive in that, there was a tremendous capital investment. But also to be able to do it efficiently means to be doing it at scale. So eventually the cost came down to the point that individual sequencers were manageable by labs. You weren't as concerned about efficiency. It didn't matter if you were running with all your lanes full of data or full of sample.
Right.
But the laboratory advancements, right, our sensing technologies continue to advance. So it's not just sequencing. We're seeing now advances in microscopy and cryo-EM, and so more and more it's the advances in the laboratory technology that are driving the volumes of data that are overwhelming the existing infrastructure for data management and analysis.
Right. Yeah, that seems to make sense, and I mean that's probably driven in part by the continuation of Moore's law and the ability to put more and more powerful processors into the laboratory instruments as well, right? CCD cameras and
short read sequencing was really about biochemistry. It was molecular biology. In fact, the engineering part and the computing part was pretty much crap for the first couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
And we used to joke about, when the Alexa machine would stop running, it's because the rubber bands broke, which was actually literally true. There was they weren't good engineers, but they were good mechanical engineers, but they were biochemical engineers. And so it was that pyrosequencing technology that really shifted in that sense.
So
not to think about where, other places, microscopy has just been continuing to drive technology. Really, the thing that advanced even faster than Moore's law for CPUs was the performance and reduced cost of CCDs, so, digital cameras.
Mm-hmm.
And so that CCD technology has also had an impact in this space.
Well, I mean, you take a look at a device like a flow cytometer. I mean, back in the day when I was a clinician, I mean, those things, you'd see them in the lab and they basically counted cells. And that was kind of it. Now they've become quite sophisticated. And the level of what they can see and do in the level of data that they produce has it's no longer just counting how many white cells and red cells anymore in flow cytometry. So we're doing a lot more with things too because of that technology.
Yeah, I think flow is another great example. And then where we are in the last 2 years, there's been this rise of single cell, which of course is all of this are tied together. These don't exist in isolation.
Right.
But 10x genomics and others. So with where we find ourselves now is we have a crap ton of data, and B, we're generating large scale multimodal data. And so now we find ourselves back in this place of, okay, I have high resolution imaging data and I have RNA-seq data. How do I analyze these together? So then you add in the rise of deep learning, which sort of appeared in this space around 2011.
What is that? What does deep learning mean to you, Matter? Yeah, what's deep learning?
I'm referring specifically to convolutional neural networks. So deep convolutional neural networks. So this is, the neural network approach had been around for decades, but with the rise of computing power and of publicly available data to train, it was really around 2010, 2011 that the deep convolutional neural networks appeared on the scene, first in the image processing space, and demonstrated a power of machine learning that we hadn't seen before. That's not that long ago.
What do you think about the culture of scientists, and do we need to start thinking also about people engineering, not just necessarily technological engineering or data engineering? Where do people come into this?
Of course. So the technology systems we've seen are a reflection of the organizations. That's the way the technology evolves. Biology. There are two things that drive this, to my mind, in this space. One is that biology itself has been traditionally a very reductionistic practice. Right? You've got your cell biologists and your molecular biologists, and you look at the NIH and you divide everything up by disease area, and yet there's nothing at NIH, no single center or institute at NIH that deals, for instance, with inflammation or remodeling, and yet we know that spans so many different diseases,
right?
But it doesn't fit into the NIH organizational structure. And then the other piece is, this is how academia works, is that academia is built around individual labs, and all the incentives are built around individual labs. So, so we had a culture that was, that still is to a large degree, emphasizing silos. So it's hard to lead that silo busting with technology, because you still run into all the cultural and social issues around data sharing and the sort of fundamental imbalance around the cost-benefit of data sharing, which is that to make data shareable requires more effort on the data producer side, but the benefit is realized by the data consumer and not the data producer. And that fundamental imbalances will continue to drive things towards silos without some investment of effort on the parts of organizations.
It seems like if we change the culture and break down and find ways to make the silos better, we address a lot of problems. Because I think the technology part of the problem here is actually not that difficult to fix.
Yep.
Tag, so.
Yep. Yeah, and so that's, that conversation has been going on for a long time, that we just, the incentives are misaligned in order to make that change, and that there are organizational barriers. This is why, my focus has been almost entirely organizational for the last 5 years. I will describe my capabilities in conversation with somebody. I have no technical capabilities anymore. I am an organizational engineer. That's what I do.
Okay.
That feels like what I have to contribute right now to this space. We all, depending on what field you're in, I think there's more and more awareness of the value of cross-disciplinary research. Data science has been a great example of this, where typically data science is about joining domain expertise with the computational and statistical expertise, which is less common to find in a single person. So just by nature of being able to have that breadth of future is cross-disciplinary. And I think, in all honesty, that's going to happen in some places reasonably quickly. And then we on the data technology side are going to be scrambling to catch up again.
That's interesting, because I think that's part of attribution also contributes to siloing.
Absolutely, yeah. That's because attribution is the currency of academia. So the entire academic system is built around attribution. I really, it's an interesting time right now with the COVID-19, where organizations will make a big deal about sharing data immediately. We're doing this for the public good. And I don't understand why we can't push people to the realization that that's exactly the same thing with cancer. Like, cancer is a bigger epidemic than COVID. It's just not spreading the same way. The value of putting data out into the public is exactly the same. So I find it frustrating that we'll pat ourselves on the back for sharing some data while we continue to go on and hoard other data.
The question I have for you is, do you think that the lack of organization of data is kind of slowing our ability to take advantage of machine learning and AI technologies? And is that one of the bottlenecks?
Yeah, absolutely. So machine learning requires data. Depending on what you're doing, it may be a lot of data, and it has to be good, clean data. And so if we don't have the processes in place to be collecting, managing good, clean data, then that's a bottleneck, right? So the joke is that a data scientist spends 80% of their time gathering and cleaning data, and the other 20% of their time complaining about spending the 80% of their time gathering and cleaning data.
That's interesting. That's kind of funny, but it's sad. It's sad that it's that way. But I mean, I'm hopeful. When we work on, we just helped Bristol Myers Squibb put together a data set of over 5 petabytes of genomics data that was indexed and brought into a platform like a Gen 3. And now all of a sudden, scientists within their organization have access, easier access to find and use that data. So, I feel hopeful that we're starting to really have initiatives like Kids First and the others, Blood Pack and those kinds of things. Do you think we'll ever get to a time where clean data sets kind of look like movies that we get from Netflix, and the ability to have a system of streaming high quality data? Because it seems like a good data set is no different than a good movie. It's all just good, clean data. And could we get to a point where data is streamed, scientific data is streamed like a movie?
Certainly, we will, for some data types, we will see much more standard sources of data. And I would argue we already are with genomic data. Right? There's standard, like all of the data formats, the processing, all of that is pretty standardized at this point. The streaming is an interesting point. I believe that it is true that in some areas we will benefit from thinking not about data as sets, but as time-dependent streams. And there's a lot of reason for that. I mean, not least of all, our ability to produce data is going up so fast.
Mm-hmm.
But to the extent that we continue to invest in a data set that they've already generated. This is what's going on with strides and not strides.
Heal? No.
It's the stage, NHLBI stage.
Oh, okay.
And to a degree, Anvil and others, but they're thinking in the backwards way rather than thinking in the forwards way, which is, okay, we're going to have data spewing out of these various sources, and we do now. I think the thing that's going to keep slowing us down in biomedicine now is our relative inability to deal as effectively with clinical data.
Why?
That NIH is not investing in, particularly we have, there's traditionally been a pretty big gap between the research side and the clinical side. There's great interest in bringing those areas closer together and building the so-called learning health system. And this is why the position of Chief Research Information Officer was created, to try to bridge those two domains. The challenge is that as the data producer, the health system sees very little value in participating in a broader ecosystem.
Right.
And that's just sort of a general statement, but if hospital leadership is kind of focused on business metrics on a 5-year horizon, and there hasn't been sufficient demonstration of learning health system, although I think it is going to come,
right,
to justify the effort on their side as data producer. Now, some are starting to see opportunities with Google and others to look at their data as an alternative source of revenue, and that's of direct interest to the hospital leadership, which is hospitals are crazy businesses, razor thin margins.
Mm-hmm.
So if they can find novel sources of revenue, that's a win. And so, a group like Google, which is just saying, "Oh yeah, give us your data, we'll do all the work on it. You don't have to do any extra work. Just give it to us, and we'll give you some money." That's appealing to some. I believe that until the hospital systems, healthcare enterprises get better about data, we are going to be hampered in our ability to drive all of the great advances on the research side into the clinical side.
This corona epidemic actually is kind of demonstrating where we actually need to be.
Yeah, I would argue that too. So Trevor Bedford, who is at Fred Hutch and has been leading since we've been having all the deaths here, he's become the statistical spokesperson for coronavirus. We were already relatively geared up because we're in our second year of this so-called Seattle Flu Project, and it's been an effort to study the propagation and mutation of flu virus.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, all of the analysis pipelines and sequencing and all of that stuff is already in place, and the sample collection and all of that, which is great. We still don't have any of the clinical data. That was one of the things that I was working on with Trevor before I left, was how can we expand beyond our local health system to be pulling in the data we need from all of the other Seattle healthcare systems, and that's a big problem.
Yeah, definitely.
It's a big problem. So, yeah, no, this is an opportunity, but the prime example of data that was not collected for secondary use, right? You collect data in a clinical setting for the sole purpose of treating that patient.
Right.
And that's reasonable. That's the mission of the health system. So there's none of apart from efforts around quality improvement, there's very little systematic reuse of those data, and I think that's a huge opportunity. That's one of the areas that I'm pretty excited about.
Yeah, I mean, that seems, when you describe that to me, it reminds me exactly of what I'm seeing in the pharmaceutical companies, is that there are researchers who are asking a single question of their data. They want to find an answer to a single question. So they do all this research just like a doctor takes care of one patient. And when they're done, they kind of put it in the medical record and close the book. Or take their findings and analysis and stuff it into a Jupyter notebook, and if we're lucky, or just put it right on a file system, which 80% of that research data will never be seen again. Don't we have professionals on both sides actually thinking of one thing at a time rather than holistically?
Yeah, no, I think that's true, and that's not an unreasonable research approach. The thing that we really haven't seen come to penetrate healthcare and life sciences is this so-called fourth paradigm of science, which is data-driven hypothesis generation.
Right.
And I think it will have big impact, but you have to have the data in order to do it.
Right.
And it's a really interesting challenge to try to talk to an ethics review board about the value of data-driven discovery. When our whole system is set on the human subjects research side is set around protecting the individual, data-driven discovery is a really hard sell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. You know, it's funny because when going back to the corona thing, you know, when we're faced with natural or some kind of disasters like these things, everybody kind of pulls together to solve the immediate problem. I'm thinking of like what America was like after 9/11, and the sense of camaraderie because we faced this horrible problem. And the sad part about it is it kind of wears off, and everybody then goes back to their normal state after a certain amount of time.
I agree. I think that's what I would argue cancer is.
How so?
Well, we don't have that collaborative infrastructure, that we've accepted it somehow as just status quo, right? COVID's new, but at some point it'll be like SARS. No one thinks about the original SARS
Right.
Anymore. And even Ebola has kind of lost its ability to get people scared and focused.
Right. So as there's another new term that's I'm curious to get your thought of. It seems like the term data ecosystems is kind of moving in and data science is moving out. What do you think about the term? What's data ecosystems mean to you, and does it have any meaning at all?
Well, I don't think it's terribly well defined. This is one that Bob Grossman's been pushing. But this is also now how NIH has taken the next step with the Data Commons Pilot Phase Consortium, right? So they're now talking about the Common Fund data ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, I would distinguish it from data science. The data ecosystem is a set of infrastructure and services that's different than,
Right. You know, it's so funny because I'm listening to all this stuff about the coronavirus, and they talk about the simple things. Are there simple things that, for good hygiene of data, perhaps, is the
Yeah, no, I do like the concept of data hygiene. It's one I haven't thought about much, but I think it's a good concept. I would argue that there are probably best practices in dealing with data, or at least better practices, and it's probably worth thinking about those and promulgating those.
does any other industry outside our field, can we look to any of those as examples of, gee, they know how to do it right?
Yeah, this is one I've been thinking about a lot. I've given up, I think, pointing at physics and astronomy, which I agree we often do in the data management and data infrastructure sense. And I've come to believe that there's really a fundamental difference in biology, in that the data that are collected in astronomy and physics, or even climate, are observations of a system, and observations of a dynamical system that naturally lend themselves to data integration and sharing. Whereas biology, you're measuring things about individuals, and we don't have that dynamics understanding of the dynamics. We don't have equations for biology that can connect the data together. So it's a different problem to try to deal with biological data, where we're collecting a number of data points on individuals, and and to try to figure out how they're connected is not straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
So the incentives are, again, it's not I think of it too in terms of ROI, it's not clear what the ROI is.
Are we always trying to look for another scientific model, but maybe we should be looking at other models?
Well, I agree that we don't have. The reason that we have all of this is that there's been this robust ecosystem in consumer data, right? So people have been able to develop business models because the data existed, and so it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg problem on the health data ecosystem side. It doesn't exist, so we don't see that same kind of innovation.
But Matter, the thing is that on those other examples, those industries actually base their whole business model around the data, so the data is the asset for them.
Correct, but that has to sit on top of an ecosystem in which you can buy and sell or otherwise transact around data.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the case on the consumer side and the media side, right? There's a well-developed ecosystem there. There's not that ecosystem on the health data side.
Right.
So, the companies that are probably closest, the ones that are sitting on top of the most data, are the payers in the system, right? Groups like Optum. And their incentives are very different. So it's hard to see how we generalize that. This is what I've been trying to do with Cascade stadia, right? I mean, I need to demonstrate that that with um, a sufficiently developed ecosystem will drive innovation and novel business models.
So you've been beating the drum about this topic for for almost ever. It seems like at least 10 years or more. I guess my final question are, why are you so passionate about this?
Fair question. This is I think there are probably really a couple of different answers. Probably the most honest answer is that this is a big gnarly problem, and I actually like working on big gnarly problems.
Okay.
I think this is an area in which I personally, but certainly the can have impact. But I think that in general, there's great opportunity to provide pretty dramatic impact in this space. It's just so desperate for new technologies, new business, new innovation to drive it. I mean, healthcare is teetering in this country.
Mm-hmm. For sure. What advice would you give if you could look back and go back 15 years and you were talking to us and you were going to give yourself advice with the knowledge that you have today? What advice would you give yourself?
I would say, good question. I think 15 years ago I wasn't thinking data. I was thinking storage. I was thinking data as nothing more than a collection of objects, and I didn't care what the objects were. And if I had been on this data bandwagon 15 years ago, I think I could have had more impact. Certainly we would have gotten road to a place closer to where it is now much sooner.
Right. Listen, we've already gone an hour. I don't want to take too much of your time, but I really, as always, Matt, I could sit and talk to you all day long.